The lights in the hospital waiting room were too bright, buzzing like angry wasps above my head. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the plastic armrest just to keep them still. The fabric was worn smooth from thousands of other anxious hands, and I wondered how many of those people had been waiting for news that would change everything. How many had sat here feeling their world crack apart, piece by piece, like ice under too much weight. Through the glass doors, I could see my oldest son pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his face twisted in that familiar expression of disgust I'd grown to know so well. His free hand was gesturing sharply, the way his father used to gesture when he was making a point, when he was convincing someone of his version of reality. I watched Marcus's mouth move, forming words I couldn't hear but could imagine. The same words he'd been saying for months, maybe years. Words about disappointment, about failure, about how his mother never measured up. I didn't know yet that he was calling his father, the man who'd spent 15 years teaching him that my love was worthless because it came without a paycheck. I didn't know that Richard was on the other end of that line, probably nodding sympathetically, probably adding fuel to whatever fire Marcus was building. I didn't know that in less than an hour, Marcus would walk back through those doors and say the words that would finally shatter whatever was left of my heart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back 3 months, back to when I still believed that sacrifice meant something. Back to when I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I loved hard enough and long enough, it would be enough. It was a Tuesday morning in Phoenix, and the heat was already climbing past 90 degrees by 8 a.m. I remember because I was standing in my tiny kitchen, the one with the peeling linoleum and the refrigerator that hummed like it was dying, trying to stretch $5 into 3 meals. The kitchen window was open, but there was no breeze, just hot air that smelled like asphalt and other people's breakfast cooking. From somewhere in the apartment complex, I could hear a baby crying and a couple arguing in Spanish, their voices carrying through the thin walls that separated one struggle from another. My youngest, Emma, was 14 then, still young enough to believe her mother hung the moon. She didn't know yet that moons don't pay for college applications or new shoes when the old ones have holes worn through the soles. She was still in her room, probably scrolling through her phone, looking at all the things her friends had that she couldn't have. But she never complained. That was the worst part, how good my kids had gotten at swallowing their disappointment, at making themselves small enough to fit inside our poverty without making too much noise about it. I was making scrambled eggs with the last 3 eggs in the carton, the ones I'd bought on sale the week before. The expiration date had passed 2 days ago, but I'd smelled them and they seemed fine, and besides, we couldn't afford to waste food. I was stirring them in our one good pan, the non-stick coating scratched and peeling when Marcus walked in. My oldest. 17 and already wearing his father's sneer like a hand-me-down jacket that fit him perfectly. He was dressed in clothes I hadn't bought him, designer jeans and a polo shirt with a logo I couldn't afford. His hair was freshly cut, the kind of cut you get at a real salon, not the supercuts where I took Jake when his hair got too long. Everything about him screamed money. Richard's money. Money that had somehow magically appeared after our divorce when it had never been there during our marriage. He looked at the eggs and wrinkled his nose. You ever see someone look at food like it's an insult? That's what he did. His lip actually curled, and for a second I saw his father so clearly in his face that I had to look away. The same expression Richard used to make when I'd suggest we eat at home instead of going out, back before I understood that the money for going out was coming from my grandmother's inheritance, from my future, from the security I'd spent years building. "I'm going to Dad's for breakfast," Marcus said, not looking at me. He was already turning away, already reaching for his phone to call for a ride. "Dad always has bacon and fresh orange juice, not the concentrate stuff." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. Not the concentrate stuff. As if the difference between fresh squeezed and concentrate was the difference between love and failure. As if I hadn't stayed up until 2 a.m. the night before, finishing my shift cleaning offices just so I could afford to buy any orange juice at all. I felt something twist in my chest, a familiar pain that I'd been carrying for so long it had become part of my normal. But I smiled anyway. I was good at smiling by then. I'd been practicing for 15 years. "Okay, honey," I said, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "Tell your dad I said hello." Marcus didn't respond. He just walked out, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded like a verdict. I stood there in my kitchen with 3 scrambled eggs in a scratched pan, and I wondered when exactly I'd lost my son. Was it the first time he went to Richard's new condo and saw how his father lived now? Was it gradual, a slow accumulation of comparisons between his dad's leather couches and my thrift store furniture? Or had Richard been working on him all along, planting seeds of doubt and resentment that had finally taken root? I turned off the stove, divided the eggs between 2 plates, called Emma to breakfast and watched her eat without complaint, without asking for bacon or fresh orange juice or anything else we couldn't afford. And I thought, not for the first time, about how unfair it was that the child who stayed saw the struggle up close, while the one who left got to pretend it didn't exist. See, I didn't start out poor. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't announce itself with sirens and flashing lights. It creeps in wearing the face of love, asking you to trust it with your future. When I married Richard, I had a decent job as a medical billing specialist, a small inheritance from my grandmother tucked away in savings, and a pension plan that would have given me security in my old age. I remember the day I got the job at the medical center. I was 23, fresh out of Arizona State with a degree in health administration. The salary wasn't huge, but it was steady. $42,000 a year with benefits and a 401k match. My supervisor, a woman named Margaret who wore reading glasses on a chain and always smelled like lavender, told me I was a natural, that I could go far in medical administration if I wanted to. I'd started taking night classes toward a master's degree. I had a plan, a future that was mine. And then I met Richard at a friend's barbecue. He was 26, working construction, all charm and big dreams. He talked about starting his own company someday, about building custom homes, about how we could have a beautiful life together. He made me feel like I was special, like together we could accomplish anything. When he proposed after 8 months, I said yes, without hesitation. I thought I was lucky to have found someone who loved me so completely. I wasn't rich, but I was stable, safe. Then Richard said he needed help managing our finances, that with him working long hours at the construction company and me about to have our first baby, it just made sense for him to handle the money stuff. He had this way of making his ideas sound like teamwork, like partnership, like it was us against the world, building something together. So I signed the papers he put in front of me. "Power of attorney," he said, "just in case something happens and you need me to access your accounts." The papers were spread out on our kitchen table, the one we'd bought together at a furniture store, financed over 2 years. Richard had made coffee, the good kind, and we were sitting there like adults making adult decisions about our future. He explained it all so carefully, how this would make it easier to pay bills, to manage the mortgage, to handle everything while I was on maternity leave. "It's just a formality," he said, sliding the papers toward me. "It doesn't change anything. It just means I can help take care of things if you need me to." I know what you're thinking. You're screaming at your screen right now, telling me I should have known better. You're thinking about all the true crime podcasts, all the news stories, all the warnings we've all heard about never signing financial documents without reading them carefully. But here's what you don't understand about trust. It doesn't ask questions because it doesn't think it needs to. I believed in us. I believed in him. I believed that when you love someone and you're building a life together, you don't treat every conversation like a potential threat. You don't approach your partner like they're a stranger trying to scam you. Or at least, I didn't. Maybe that was naive. Maybe that was stupid. But it was real, and it was mine. And Richard knew exactly how to use it against me. And for a while, everything seemed fine. We had Marcus, and I fell into motherhood like falling into a dream. He was 7 pounds, 3 ounces, with dark hair and my nose and Richard's eyes. I'd hold him at 3 a.m., exhausted and sore, and so full of love I thought I might burst from it. And I'd think about the future we were building for him. The stable home, the 2 parents who loved each other, the security I'd never quite had growing up. Then 2 years later, Jake came along. Quieter than Marcus, more observant. Even as a baby, he'd watch everything with these serious eyes, like he was taking notes on the world. And then Emma, 3 years after that, my surprise baby, my last baby, the one who completed our family in a way I hadn't known we needed. I quit my job when Marcus was born because childcare cost more than I was making, and Richard said we'd be fine on his income. He said he'd take care of us. He said that's what partners did. That's what fathers did. That I should focus on the kids and let him handle the finances. And I thought that was reasonable. I thought that was how families worked. I didn't know that I was signing away my economic independence with every year I stayed home. I didn't know that the gap in my resume was growing wider, that my skills were getting outdated, that every month I spent out of the workforce was another nail in the coffin of my employability. I thought I was being a good mother. Richard made sure I thought that. He'd praise me for my sacrifices, tell me I was amazing for staying home with the kids, make me feel valued for all the invisible labor I was doing. But he never mentioned that while I was changing diapers and doing laundry and making dinner from scratch to save money, he was making decisions about our money, about my money, about the future I'd been building before I met him. He never mentioned that my value to him wasn't in my sacrifice. It was in my access to resources he could drain. The debt started showing up about 4 years into our marriage. At first, it was small stuff, a maxed-out credit card here, a loan I didn't remember taking there. I'd be doing laundry and find a collection notice in Richard's jeans pocket. Or I'd get a phone call from a creditor asking about a payment that was 60 days overdue. Every time, Richard would have an explanation. The credit card was for a work emergency, tools he needed to buy when his were stolen from a job site. The loan was for a truck repair that he'd forgotten to mention. The overdue payment was a billing error. He'd paid it. They must have messed up. And every time he'd get defensive when I asked about it, say I was questioning his ability to provide, that I should focus on the kids and let him handle the grown-up stuff. "I'm working 60 hours a week to keep a roof over our heads," he'd say, his voice tight with what seemed like hurt. "I'm doing everything I can. Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I like struggling?" And I'd feel guilty for bringing it up. I'd apologize for making him feel bad. I'd tell myself that he was right, that he was working hard, that marriage was about supporting each other through difficult times. I'd resolve to be more understanding, more patient, more grateful for everything he was doing. I didn't see the pattern because I was living inside it. That's how gaslighting works. It doesn't flip your reality upside down all at once. It tilts it slowly, degree by degree, until you can't remember which way is up anymore. And I did. God help me, I did. Because I bought into this idea that holding our family together, keeping the peace, being the stable one, that was my job. That was my purpose. He needed me to believe that. And I was so busy changing diapers and packing lunches and helping with homework that I didn't see how he was slowly draining my grandmother's inheritance, one bad business deal at a time. My grandmother, my mom's mother, had been a school teacher for 40 years. She'd saved carefully, invested wisely, lived modestly. When she died, she left me $38,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was security. It was a down payment on a house, or a college fund for the kids, or a cushion for emergencies. I'd put it in a high-yield savings account, watched it grow slowly with compound interest. I'd felt proud, knowing I had this foundation to build on. Richard convinced me to move it to a joint account. "For estate planning purposes," he said. "If something happens to you, I need to be able to access it for the kids." It made sense. I signed the papers. Within 2 years, it was gone. I found out when I tried to transfer money for new winter coats, and the transaction was declined. It was November, and the temperature had dropped suddenly, the way it does in Phoenix when fall finally decides to show up. Marcus's coat from the previous year was too small, the sleeves ending halfway up his forearms. Jake's had a broken zipper. Emma was still small enough to fit into hers, but barely. By the time the kids were in elementary school, my savings account was empty. I found out when I tried to transfer money for new winter coats, and the transaction was declined. When I called the bank, they told me the account had been closed 6 months earlier. All funds withdrawn. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I was standing in our kitchen, the nice kitchen in the house we'd bought with my grandmother's money as a down payment, holding the phone in one hand and a grocery list in the other. My hands started to shake. My vision went blurry at the edges. "There must be a mistake," I said to the bank representative. A woman with a patient voice who'd probably dealt with this exact situation 100 times before. I didn't close that account. According to our records, Mr. Richard Hayes closed the account on May 15th and withdrew the full balance of $38,247.18. I confronted Richard that night after the kids were asleep. We sat at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd signed the power of attorney, where we'd made so many decisions about our future. Except I was realizing, too late, that we hadn't been making decisions together. He'd been making decisions, and I'd been signing papers. "Where's my grandmother's money?" I asked, my voice shaking. I'd rehearsed this conversation all day, trying to find the right words, the right tone. Not too accusatory, because Richard didn't respond well to accusations. Not too emotional, because he'd dismiss me as hysterical. Just facts, just questions, just please explain this to me so it makes sense. He had this whole story ready. I could tell from the way he launched into it without hesitation, without the pauses that come when someone's trying to remember the truth. He'd invested it, he said, in a business opportunity with a guy from work. Custom home building, the thing Richard had always dreamed about. It was supposed to double our money, supposed to set us up for life. But the partner had screwed him over, taken the money, and disappeared. Richard had tried to get it back, had even talked to a lawyer, but there was nothing to be done. "I was trying to build something for us," he said, and there were actual tears in his eyes. "I was trying to give you and the kids a better life. And it failed, and I'm sorry, but I can't change it now. All I can do is work harder and try to make it up to you." He promised he'd pay it all back, swore on our children's lives it would never happen again. He held my hands across the table and looked into my eyes with such apparent sincerity that I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. What was I supposed to do? We had 3 kids and a mortgage. I couldn't just leave. Where would I go? I hadn't worked in 5 years. My resume had a gap the size of a canyon. My professional contacts had dried up. I had no money of my own, no credit cards in just my name, no savings, no safety net, and 3 children who depended on me to hold their world together. So I believed him. Again. I justified it by telling myself that marriages go through rough patches, that he was trying his best, that at least the kids had a roof over their heads. I clung to this fantasy that my love alone could stabilize our family, that if I just sacrificed a little more, worked a little harder to make every dollar stretch, everything would work out. I started doing extreme couponing, spending hours every week cutting out little pieces of paper that might save us 30 cents on toothpaste. I learned to make meals that cost less than $2 per serving. I shopped at thrift stores for the kids' clothes, got good at eyeballing sizes and finding the items that looked almost new. I cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror, watched YouTube tutorials on how to trim split ends and layer it so it didn't look homemade. I gave up everything that cost money, magazines and coffee shops, and the occasional lunch out with friends. until my world shrank to the size of our mortgage payment and grocery budget. That's the lie I told myself every single day for the next 11 years. I started working again when Emma started kindergarten, took a part-time job at a medical clinic doing data entry. It wasn't much, barely minimum wage, but it was mine. Or so I thought. The clinic was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation office, the kind of place that smelled like antiseptic and old magazines. My desk was in a windowless room with fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered, and I'd spend 5 hours a day entering patient information into an outdated computer system. But I didn't care about the humming lights or the lack of windows. I was working again. I was using my brain for something other than figuring out how to make a rotisserie chicken last for 5 meals. I had coworkers who asked about my day and remembered my coffee order. I had a paycheck with my name on it, proof that I had value beyond what I could provide for my family. Richard convinced me to deposit my checks into our joint account, said it would be easier for bill paying, for keeping track of everything. "We're a team," he said. "What's yours is mine, and what's mine is yours, right? That's how marriage works." I should have known better by then, but hope is a stubborn thing. It keeps you believing even when all the evidence says you're a fool. The money I earned disappeared as fast as I made it. Faster, actually, because Richard had discovered online gambling by then. I didn't know that yet, though. All I knew was that I was working 25 hours a week, and we still couldn't afford to fix the car when it broke down or buy the kids new clothes for school pictures. I'd check our account balance online and see my paycheck deposited on Friday, and by Monday it would be gone. Not spent on groceries or utilities or any of the practical things we needed. Just gone, transferred out to accounts I didn't recognize, withdrawn from ATMs at casinos I didn't know Richard visited. When I asked about it, he'd get angry. Say I was micromanaging him, that I didn't understand how money worked, that he was handling things and I needed to trust him. And there was always just enough money for the mortgage payment, just enough to keep the lights on, just enough to prevent complete catastrophe. So I told myself maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was remembering the account balance wrong. Maybe this was normal, and I just didn't understand, because I'd been out of the workforce for so long. I was shopping at thrift stores and clipping coupons and making casseroles that would stretch for 3 days, and meanwhile, Richard was coming home later and later, always with some excuse about overtime or meeting up with the guys. The thing about financial abuse is that it's invisible. Nobody sees the bruises. When the other moms at school drop-off were talking about their family vacations to Disneyland, I'd smile and nod and make excuses about why we couldn't go. "We're saving for a house renovation," I'd say, or "We're trying to teach the kids that experiences close to home are just as valuable." I'd watch their faces, see the pity or the judgment, and I'd hold my smile until my face hurt. When Marcus asked why he couldn't do traveling soccer like his friends, I'd explain that we had to save money, that not everyone could afford everything they wanted. I'd make it sound like a values choice, like we were teaching him important lessons about gratitude and contentment. I didn't tell him that his father had gambled away my pension, that the retirement I'd spent 10 years building was gone, converted to cash and fed into slot machines and poker tables. I didn't tell him because I didn't know yet. I was still operating under the assumption that we were struggling together, that poverty was something that had happened to us, not something that had been done to me. I found out about the pension on a random Tuesday afternoon. I'd gotten a letter from the Arizona State Retirement System saying they needed to verify my account status. I called the number on the letter, expecting it to be some routine administrative thing. The woman who answered asked for my social security number and date of birth, and then went quiet for a long minute. "Mrs. Hayes," she finally said, "I'm showing that your pension account was cashed out in 2014. Did you initiate that withdrawal?" 2014, 3 years earlier. I'd been working at the medical center then, contributing to my pension every month, or so I thought. Apparently, Richard had used his power of attorney to cash it out, taking the lump sum payment even though it meant losing thousands in penalties and future benefits. $47,000. That's what my pension had been worth. It would have grown to over 200,000 by the time I retired. It would have been the difference between security and poverty in my old age. And Richard had taken it, cashed it out, gambled it away, and never said a word. I hung up the phone and sat in my car in the clinic parking lot for an hour, just staring at nothing. I kept thinking I should feel something, rage or devastation, or something big enough to match the enormity of what had been stolen from me. But all I felt was tired, so incredibly tired. My middle son, Jake, figured it out first, I think. He was always the observant one, quiet where Marcus was loud, careful where Emma was trusting. I caught him looking at me sometimes with this expression that was too old for his face, like he could see through all my bright reassurances to the exhaustion underneath. One night, he came into the kitchen while I was packing lunches for the next day. He was 12, maybe 13, already getting tall and gangly. He watched me for a minute, watched me carefully portion out the peanut butter so it would last until payday, watched me wrap each sandwich in wax paper because sandwich bags cost money. "Mom," he said quietly, "are we poor?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell him everything was fine, that we were just being careful with money, that this was temporary. But he was looking at me with such serious eyes, such knowing eyes, that I couldn't. "We're struggling a little right now, honey," I said, "but we're going to be okay." He nodded, didn't push for more details. But after that, I noticed him doing little things, taking smaller portions at dinner, never asking for new things, wearing shoes until they literally fell apart, making himself smaller, quieter, less of a burden. But he never said anything. None of them did. They just learned to stop asking for things, learned to make their disappointment small enough to swallow. The years blurred together after that. Work, bills, kids, repeat. I was so tired all the time, bone tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I'd wake up exhausted and go to bed exhausted, and the space in between was just an endless cycle of trying to make not enough stretch far enough. I stopped doing the things that used to bring me joy. My morning coffee on the porch, that 5 minutes of peace before the chaos started, I gave that up when I realized I couldn't afford the good coffee anymore, and the cheap stuff tasted like guilt. Every sip was a reminder of what I couldn't provide, what I'd lost, how far I'd fallen from the person I used to be. Reading, which had always been my escape, I stopped because by the time I got the kids to bed and cleaned up the kitchen and packed lunches for the next day, I was too exhausted to focus on words on a page. Books required concentration, required the ability to lose yourself in another world, and I couldn't afford to lose myself. I had to stay present, stay vigilant, stay ready for the next crisis. I stopped seeing friends because I was ashamed of how small my life had become. Linda would call and suggest lunch, and I'd make excuses. Too busy with work. One of the kids has a thing, maybe next month. After a while, she stopped calling. They all did. And I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need friends, that all I needed was to get through each day and make sure my kids were okay. I stopped looking in mirrors because I didn't recognize the hollow-eyed woman staring back at me. Somewhere between 25 and 40, I'd lost myself. The girl who'd graduated from Arizona State with plans and dreams and a whole future ahead of her, she was gone. In her place was this exhausted shell who moved through life on autopilot, who smiled when expected and cried only in the shower where no one could hear. Richard filed for divorce when Marcus was 15. I came home from work one day and he was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of him. Divorce petition, it said at the top. Irreconcilable differences. He didn't look at me when I walked in, just pushed the papers across the table and said, "I think we both know this hasn't been working for a long time." He said he'd found someone else, someone who didn't make him feel like a failure just by existing. Someone who appreciated him, who understood him, who didn't constantly stress about money. He said it like it was my fault, like my very reasonable concern about our dire financial situation was a character flaw rather than a rational response to his financial abuse. I didn't fight it. I was too worn down to fight anymore. Part of me was almost relieved. Maybe without Richard's gambling, without his constant draining of resources, I could finally start to build something stable. Maybe I could finally catch my breath. The divorce settlement gave him the house I'd helped pay for with my grandmother's inheritance, the car, and all the debt in my name. My lawyer, a public defender who handled the case pro bono because I couldn't afford to pay, told me it was the best we could hope for. Arizona is a community property state, she explained, her voice weary like she'd given this speech too many times before. All debts incurred during the marriage are considered joint debts, regardless of whose name they're in. And since Richard has been the primary earner for most of your marriage, the court is unlikely to view the debt distribution as unfair. But I didn't make that debt, I said. He gambled away my money, my inheritance, my pension. She looked at me with sympathy but not hope. Can you prove that? Do you have records of the gambling? Bank statements showing the transfers? Evidence that you didn't consent to those withdrawals? I didn't. I had nothing but my word against Richard's, and the legal system doesn't run on truth. It runs on evidence, and Richard had been careful. The withdrawals from my accounts had been legal, authorized by the power of attorney I'd signed 15 years earlier. The gambling had been done with cash, untraceable, and the debt in my name. Well, I'd been married to him, hadn't I? I'd benefited from the lifestyle those loans had provided, or at least that's how the court saw it. I walked away with my clothes, my kids half the time, and enough debt to drown in. That's when the real poverty started. When you're married, even to someone who's destroying you financially, you can at least pretend you're a team. You can split the bills, share the burden, tell yourself you're struggling together. When you're divorced and single-parenting 3 kids with no savings, no assets, and debts that keep multiplying like a virus, there's nowhere to hide from the reality. I moved us into a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots sounded like fireworks, and the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbors breathing. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better days, probably sometime in the 1970s. The carpet was stained with mysteries I didn't want to solve. The kitchen cabinets didn't close properly. The bathroom had mold in the corners that I couldn't get rid of no matter how much bleach I used. Marcus got the bedroom. Jake and Emma shared the other one, and I slept on the couch. It was a pull-out couch I'd bought from Craigslist for $75, and the metal bar in the middle dug into my back no matter how I positioned myself. I'd lie there at night, listening to sirens and arguments through the walls, and I'd think about the future I'd imagined when I was 23. The master's degree, the career advancement, the retirement security. All of it gone. Traded for a marriage that had been a lie from the start. I worked 2 jobs, the clinic during the day and cleaning offices at night. I'd finish at the clinic at 5, drive across town to the office building where I was part of the cleaning crew, work until midnight, drive home, fall into bed for 5 hours, then get up and do it all again. The cleaning job paid cash under the table, which meant no taxes, but also no workers' comp when I threw out my back moving a desk, no sick pay when I got the flu and had to work through it anyway, because missing a shift meant not making rent. Marcus started spending more time at his father's place. Richard had moved into a nice condo with his new girlfriend, a woman 10 years younger than me who worked in pharmaceutical sales and wore heels that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Ashley, her name was. I'd seen her once when I dropped the kids off, seen her perfect hair and perfect makeup and perfect smile, and I'd understood immediately why Richard had chosen her. She was everything I wasn't anymore. Young, successful, unburdened by years of betrayal and poverty. Suddenly, he had money for things he'd never had money for before. Season tickets to the Suns games, a new truck, one of those massive Ford F-150s with leather seats, and a sound system that probably cost more than my car was worth. Dinners at steakhouses where the kids would come home talking about filet mignon and lobster tail, while I was serving them hamburger helper, stretched with extra noodles. And Marcus, my firstborn, the kid I'd rocked to sleep 1,000 nights, the one I'd nursed through colic and fevers and bad dreams, he ate it up. He'd come home from weekends at his dad's talking about all the things they did, all the places they went, and every word was a little knife sliding between my ribs. "Dad took us to Topgolf," he'd say, not quite looking at me. "Have you ever been? It's really cool. You can hit golf balls and eat food and there's like music and stuff." Or, "Dad's girlfriend has a Tesla. It drives itself. Can you believe that?" Or, "Dad said, maybe this summer we can go to California. He's thinking about renting a house right on the beach for a week." Each statement was casual, thrown out like it meant nothing. But I could see what he was doing, even if he couldn't. He was building a case, constructing an argument that proved his father was successful and I was not, that his father had value and I did not, that his father's love came with perks and mine came with sacrifice, and which one would any rational person choose? You know that saying about how love should be enough? It's a lie. Love doesn't pay for braces or field trips or college applications. Love doesn't keep the lights on when the utility bill is overdue. And teenage boys, especially ones who've spent their whole lives watching their mother struggle, they don't always understand the difference between poverty that's inflicted and poverty that's chosen. Marcus started to pull away. Slowly at first, then faster. He'd make these comments about how things were better at Dad's, how Dad actually had his life together, how maybe if I'd worked harder or been smarter with money, we wouldn't be in this situation. "I don't understand why you can't just get a better job," he said once, standing in our cramped apartment kitchen with his arms crossed. He was 16 by then, already taller than me, his voice deep like his father's. "There are people who do medical billing and make, like, good money. Why don't you do that?" "I'm working 2 jobs, Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm doing the best I can." "Yeah, but maybe your best isn't good enough." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather, like he hadn't just gutted me with 7 words. "Dad says you made bad choices, that you could have gone back to school or got certified in something that pays better, but you chose not to." Each word was designed to wound, and every single one hit its mark. I tried to explain it to him once. We were in the car, driving back from a dentist appointment he'd complained about the whole time because his dad's girlfriend knew a dentist who was nicer and in a better part of town. I pulled over into a parking lot, turned off the engine, and turned to face my son. Tried to tell him about the power of attorney, about the gambling, about how his father had spent 15 years systematically draining every resource I had, about the inheritance and the pension and the debt, about how I'd worked and sacrificed and done everything I could. And it still hadn't been enough, because you can't build something when someone else is tearing it down faster than you can construct it. But Richard had gotten to him first, planted his version of the story so deep that mine sounded like excuses. In Richard's version, I was the irresponsible one, the one who couldn't manage money, the one who'd let our family fall apart. And Marcus believed him. "That's not what Dad says," Marcus said, staring out the window instead of at me. "Dad says you spent his money on stupid stuff, that you made him sign for loans and then didn't pay them back, that you were the one who wanted the big house we couldn't afford." "Marcus, that's not true. I can show you the bank statements. I can prove—" "Dad said you'd say that you'd try to make yourself look like the victim." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were Richard's eyes, cold and certain. "Why should I believe you over him? He's the one taking care of me. He's the one who actually has money to do things. You're the one who can't even afford to buy me new shoes." What's truth compared to that? I thought things couldn't get worse. Then my friend Linda came to visit. We'd gone to Arizona State together, back when I was a different person with different dreams. We'd been roommates sophomore year, had stayed up too late studying and talking about our futures, about the careers we'd have and the lives we'd build. She'd wanted to work in nonprofit management. I'd wanted to run a hospital department. We'd had such clear visions of who we'd become. She'd moved to Portland after graduation, got her master's degree in public administration, and ended up running a women's shelter. We'd kept in touch through Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, but we hadn't seen each other in probably 10 years. She was in Phoenix for a conference on domestic violence prevention, and she asked if she could stop by. I almost said no. I was so ashamed of where we were living, of what my life had become. Linda had achieved everything she'd set out to do, had built the life we'd both dreamed about back in college, and I'd ended up here, in a third-floor apartment with stained carpet and mold in the bathroom, working 2 jobs and still barely surviving. But Linda was persistent, and some part of me was desperate for connection with someone who remembered who I used to be. Someone who'd known me before Richard, before the slow erosion of everything I'd been. So I said yes. And I spent the 3 days before her visit cleaning the apartment obsessively, trying to make it look less desperate. I scrubbed the mold with bleach until my hands were raw. I rearranged the furniture to hide the worst stains. I bought flowers from the grocery store, cheap carnations that were wilting at the edges, but still gave the illusion of normalcy. She showed up on a Saturday afternoon with flowers of her own and wine, dressed in clothes that whispered money in a way that screamed poverty by contrast. Her suit was tailored, her shoes were leather, her bag was one of those expensive ones that doesn't advertise its brand because people who know. Emma answered the door because I was in the bathroom trying to make myself presentable, trying to put on enough armor to face my old friend's pity. When I came out, Linda was standing in my living room, taking in the second-hand furniture and the water stain on the ceiling and the general air of barely holding on that permeated everything. The look on her face, I'll never forget it. It wasn't disgust, exactly. It was worse. It was recognition. Like she was seeing something she'd seen before, something she knew how to name. We sat on my worn-out couch, and she poured wine into mismatched glasses I'd gotten from a yard sale. For a while, we made small talk, caught up on surface-level stuff. Her job at the shelter, the conference she was attending, my work at the clinic, the kids' schools. But Linda had always been the type who could sense when something was wrong. And finally, she just looked at me and said, "Honey, don't you see what's happening here?" And something about the way she said it, with such gentle certainty, such complete understanding, it cracked something open inside me. I told her everything. Words I'd been holding in for years came pouring out like a flood. About the power of attorney I'd signed when I was young and trusting and stupid. About the debt that kept accumulating in my name while Richard lived well. About his gambling and his new girlfriend and their comfortable condo. About Marcus's growing contempt and Jake's quiet observation and Emma's determined cheerfulness that was starting to crack at the edges. About how I was working 70 hours a week and still couldn't afford to buy Jake new shoes when his old ones fell apart. About how the soul had separated from the upper and I'd tried to glue it back together with super glue from the dollar store, and it had held for maybe 3 days before coming apart again. About how Jake had worn them anyway, stuffed newspaper in the toe to keep the sole attached, walked around school like that for 2 weeks until I got paid and could buy him a new pair from Walmart. About how I'd given up my morning coffee and my books and my dignity piece by piece until there was almost nothing left of the person I used to be. About how some days I looked in the mirror and couldn't remember who I was supposed to be, who I'd been before Richard convinced me I was worthless. Linda listened without interrupting, and when I was done, when I'd finally emptied myself of all the words I'd been carrying, she reached across and took my hand. She told me about a support group she'd attended in Portland after her own divorce, after her ex-husband had emptied their bank account and disappeared with a woman he'd met online. About how she'd learned the term financial abuse and realized that's what her ex-husband had been doing to her for years. She told me statistics I'd never heard before, about how 1 in 6 seniors worldwide suffers some form of abuse, and how financial abuse specifically is one of the most common and least recognized forms of domestic violence. She said the World Health Organization had documented this, that it was real, that it had a name, that I wasn't alone or crazy or weak for not seeing it sooner. "It's designed to be invisible," Linda said, her grip on my hand firm and warm. "That's how it works. The abuser isolates you, controls your access to resources, makes you doubt your own perceptions. And they do it slowly, so slowly that you don't notice until you're already trapped." And something about having it named, having it validated by someone who understood, it was like she'd given me permission to be angry. For 15 years, I'd been so focused on surviving, on keeping the kids fed and the lights on, that I'd never stopped to feel the rage that was my right to feel. But sitting there on my thrift store couch, drinking cheap wine with my old friend, I finally let myself acknowledge the truth. I hadn't failed my family. My family had failed me. Richard had failed me. And somehow, through all his manipulation and lies, he'd convinced our son to fail me too. After Linda left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything she'd said, about how financial abuse works, about the patterns and tactics abusers use. I got up from my pull-out couch and sat at the tiny kitchen table with my laptop, the one I'd bought refurbished for $100, and I started researching. I learned about economic control as a form of domestic violence, about how abusers use money as a weapon, limiting their victims' access to financial resources to maintain power and control, about how they often target people with existing assets, like inheritance or pension funds, systematically draining those resources while accumulating debt in the victim's name. I learned about how abusers isolate their victims, cutting them off from friends and family who might offer support or alternative perspectives. I thought about all the times Richard had discouraged me from seeing people, always with reasonable-sounding excuses. "Linda is judgmental," he'd say. "Your sister is too negative. Those friends from college don't understand our life." Slowly, systematically, he'd shrunk my world until it was just him and the kids and me, until his version of reality was the only one I heard. I learned about gaslighting, about how abusers make their victims doubt their own perceptions and memories. I thought about all the times I'd questioned myself, wondered if maybe I was remembering things wrong, if maybe our financial problems were my fault after all. About how Richard would deny things I'd seen with my own eyes, rewrite history until I couldn't trust myself anymore. About how abusers isolate their victims and rewrite history until the victim starts to believe the abuser's version of reality. I thought about all the times Richard had made me feel stupid for questioning him, for wanting to see bank statements, for asking where money was going. I thought about how he'd slowly cut me off from friends and family, always with reasonable-sounding excuses about how they didn't understand our situation or how they were bad influences. I thought about how he'd taken something as simple as trust, something that should be the foundation of a marriage, and weaponized it against me. How he'd used my love as a tool for my own destruction. The next morning, I didn't make my coffee and sit on the porch. I couldn't. That ritual had been my 5 minutes of peace, my small claim to normalcy, and somewhere along the way, I'd let it become just another thing I couldn't afford. When I realized that, when I understood that I'd given up even that tiny pleasure because I was so beaten down I didn't think I deserved it anymore, something inside me finally broke. But this time, it didn't break apart. It broke open. And what came out wasn't sadness anymore. It was rage. Cold, clear, purposeful rage. I started making a plan. Not a plan for confronting Richard, because I knew that wouldn't work. He was too good at twisting words, at making me doubt myself, at playing the victim when he was the victimizer. And I definitely couldn't count on Marcus to believe me over his father, not when Richard's version of reality came with a bigger allowance and better Wi-Fi. But I could prepare. I could quietly, carefully, build an escape route for myself. Build something that was mine, that Richard couldn't touch. That would prove to myself, if no one else, that I was capable and competent and not the failure I'd been told I was. I couldn't confront Richard directly. I knew that. He was too good at twisting words, at making me doubt myself, at playing the victim when he was the victimizer. And I definitely couldn't count on Marcus to believe me over his father. Not when Richard's version of reality came with a bigger allowance and better Wi-Fi. But I could prepare. I could quietly, carefully, build an escape route for myself. Research shows that 15 to 19% of people maintain hidden savings accounts, money their partners don't know about. I'd always thought that sounded dishonest, like something people did when they were planning to leave. But then I realized that's exactly what I was doing. Not planning to leave Richard, I'd already done that. The divorce was final. but planning to leave behind the version of myself that he'd created. The powerless victim who couldn't manage money, who made bad decisions, who was responsible for her own poverty. I needed to stop hemorrhaging money into a void and start building something that was mine. I opened a new checking account at a different bank, one across town that Richard would never have reason to visit. I told them I was separating my finances after a divorce, and the banker, a young woman with kind eyes, set everything up with no questions asked. I started with $20, money I'd saved from returning soda cans for the deposit. It felt ridiculous, opening a bank account with $20 like I was a child with a piggy bank. But it was mine. Completely, entirely, legally mine. I started taking on extra cleaning jobs, the kind that paid cash under the table. I'd put up flyers at the grocery store offering house cleaning services, and I'd get calls from people who wanted someone to deep clean before a party or after a renovation. The work was hard, harder than the office cleaning I was already doing, but it paid better and it was untraceable. I'd deposit that money into my secret account. It wasn't much, sometimes only $20 or $30 a week. Some weeks it was more if I got a big job or multiple small ones. I found a woman who wanted her house cleaned every other week and paid me $60 cash each time. That became my anchor, my guaranteed income that Richard couldn't touch. But it was mine. Richard couldn't touch it. Marcus couldn't sneer at it. It was proof that I still existed as something other than a source of disappointment and debt. The account grew slowly. $10 here, $15 there. I'd find change in coat pockets and couch cushions and add it to the pile. The kids would sometimes leave coins on their dressers, and I'd feel like a thief taking them, but I'd do it anyway. Tell myself I'd pay them back someday when I had enough. I'd take surveys online for pennies and gift cards, spend my lunch breaks at the clinic clicking through questions about products I'd never buy, earning 50 cents at a time. I'd skip meals to save on groceries and deposit the difference. Instead of buying lunch, I'd tell myself I wasn't hungry, drink water to fill my stomach, and put the $5 I would have spent into my account. I lost weight, not in a healthy way, but in a not eating enough way, and I told myself it was fine, it was worth it. Every dollar in that account was a dollar toward freedom. It probably sounds pathetic, squirreling away $5 bills like I was preparing for the apocalypse. But you have to understand, every single dollar in that account represented a future that Richard hadn't stolen. It represented possibility, hope, and I guarded it with everything I had. I had a debit card for the account, and I kept it hidden inside an old tampon box in my bathroom, the one place I knew Marcus would never look. Every few days, I'd check the balance on my phone, just to remind myself it was real, to see the number slowly climbing. $127, $183, $204. Each milestone felt like a victory. For months, I played the role Richard had written for me. The struggling single mom, barely keeping her head above water, too overwhelmed to be a threat to anyone. I didn't argue when Marcus compared our apartment unfavorably to his dad's condo. I didn't defend myself when Richard told the kids I was bad with money. I smiled and nodded and let them all think I was exactly what they believed me to be, small and defeated and harmless. But inside, I was planning, calculating, preparing for the moment when I'd finally tell the truth, not just to Richard or Marcus, but to everyone. When I'd stop protecting the people who'd never protected me. That moment came at Thanksgiving. Richard's mother insisted on hosting, said it would be good for the kids to have the whole family together. Diane, her name was, a woman who'd never liked me even when Richard and I were married. She'd always thought her son had married beneath him, that I wasn't pretty enough or accomplished enough or from a good enough family. The fact that I was now poor and divorced only confirmed what she'd believed all along. I almost said no. The thought of sitting at a table with Richard and his girlfriend, with his parents who'd always looked at me like I was never quite good enough for their son, with Marcus who couldn't stand to be in the same room with me anymore, it made me physically ill. But Emma begged me to come, said she wanted us all to be together, that Thanksgiving was supposed to be about family, and I couldn't say no to her. So I went. I brought a pie made from ingredients I'd bought on sale, pumpkin from a can, and a crust I'd made from scratch because buying pre-made was too expensive. I'd burned it slightly around the edges because our oven in the apartment ran hot and I'd forgotten to adjust the temperature. I wrapped it in aluminum foil, hoping no one would notice. I walked into that house wearing my best thrift store dress, a navy blue thing that was a little too big in the shoulders and a little too tight in the hips, but it was the nicest thing I owned. I'd done my hair carefully, putting it up in a style I'd seen on YouTube, trying to look put together even though I felt like I was falling apart. And I smiled like my heart wasn't a grenade with the pin already pulled. Dinner was exactly as awful as I'd anticipated. We sat at Diane's formal dining table, the one she'd inherited from her mother, with the good china and crystal glasses. Ashley was there, touching Richard's arm and laughing too loud at his jokes. She was wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her highlighted hair falling in perfect waves around her face. Richard's girlfriend, Ashley, kept touching his arm and laughing too loud at his jokes. Richard's mother kept making pointed comments about how good Richard looked, how much happier he seemed now. "You know, Richard," she said, passing him the sweet potatoes, "you've really just blossomed since the divorce. Haven't you lost weight? You look so healthy." Marcus sat next to his father, occasionally shooting me looks that ranged from pity to contempt. Jake was quiet, pushing food around his plate and not making eye contact with anyone, like he could make himself invisible through stillness. And Emma, sweet Emma, kept trying to fill the silence with cheerful chatter that nobody wanted to hear. "This turkey is really good, Grandma," Emma said, her voice too bright. "Did you brine it? My friend Sophie's mom brines their turkey, and she says it makes it really juicy." Diane smiled at Emma, but it was a tight smile. "No, dear, I just followed the recipe on the package." We made it through the turkey and the small talk. Then Richard's father asked how I was managing, if I'd found a better job yet, and the way he asked it, with this tone that suggested my struggle, was a personal failing rather than a systematic dismantling. Something snapped. Richard's father, Roger, was a retired banker, a man who'd spent his career managing other people's money and thought that gave him the authority to judge everyone's financial decisions. He looked at me across the table, his reading glasses perched on his nose, and said, "So, how are you managing these days? Has the clinic given you that raise you were hoping for?" I hadn't told him I was hoping for a raise. I'd barely spoken to him since the divorce. He was fishing, trying to confirm his assumption that I was failing, still struggling, still proving that I'd never been good enough for his son. I put down my fork. I looked around that table at all these people who'd spent years watching Richard destroy me financially and emotionally, and had done nothing, said nothing, chosen to believe his version of events because it was easier than confronting the truth. And I started talking. I told them about the power of attorney I'd signed when I was 25 and pregnant and stupid with trust. I told them about the inheritance Richard had gambled away, about the pension he'd cashed out, about the debt he'd accumulated in my name. $38,000, I said, my voice steady. That's what my grandmother left me. Richard convinced me to put it in a joint account for estate planning purposes, and within 2 years it was gone. Gambled away at Casino Arizona and Talking Stick Resort. Richard's face went red. I'm not finished, I said, and something in my voice made him stop. Then there was my pension. $47,000 I'd built up over 10 years of working at the medical center. Richard cashed it out using his power of attorney in 2014. I didn't find out until 3 years later. I told them about working 2 jobs while he spent money we didn't have on girlfriends and poker games. I told them about the years I'd spent believing I was the problem, that I was the one who couldn't manage money, while he systematically drained every resource I had. I worked 70 hours a week, I continued, looking at Roger now. I had 2 jobs, one at the clinic and one cleaning offices. And do you know where that money went? Into paying off debt that Richard had accumulated. Credit cards he'd maxed out, loans he'd taken in my name, A second mortgage on our house that I didn't know about until the divorce. Richard tried to interrupt, tried to spin his usual lies, but I didn't let him. I just kept talking, kept laying out fact after fact, date after date, transaction after transaction. I'd spent weeks preparing for this, printing out everything I could access from banks and credit card companies. I'd organized it all in a folder, and I'd brought it with me, carried it into Diane's house like ammunition. I spread them across the table like evidence in a courtroom, and I made them look at the numbers. The withdrawals from my account, the loans taken in my name, the pattern of financial abuse that had been going on for 15 years. This, I said, pointing to a bank statement, is a withdrawal of $12 owned dollars from my savings account in 2009. Richard, do you remember what you told me that money was for? He didn't answer. You said it was for a business investment, that we'd double our money in 6 months. But really, you spent it at the casino, didn't you? Ashley had gone very still, her hand no longer on Richard's arm. And this, I continued, pulling out another document, is the paperwork from when you cashed out my pension. $47,000 with penalties and taxes that brought it down to $38,000. Where did that money go? Richard? When I was done, the silence was deafening. Richard's face had gone red, then white. His mother was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Ashley looked uncomfortable, like she was reconsidering some life choices, like maybe she was wondering if Richard had a gambling problem she didn't know about, if she was next in line to be drained dry. And Marcus, God. Marcus was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not belief, not yet, but maybe the beginning of doubt. Like he was seeing me for the first time in years, really seeing me. Not the failure Richard had told him I was, but a person who'd been systematically destroyed. I stood up from the table, thanked Richard's mother for dinner in a voice that was perfectly polite and completely empty. Thank you for having us, Diane. The turkey was lovely. Told my kids I loved them, that I'd always love them, but that I couldn't keep sacrificing myself on the altar of everyone else's comfort. And then I walked out. Emma followed me immediately, her footsteps quick behind mine. Jake, a few seconds later, quiet as always, but there, always there. Marcus stayed at the table. I'd known he would, but I left anyway. The weeks that followed were strange. I'd expected something to happen after my Thanksgiving confession. Legal consequences for Richard, maybe. An apology. Some kind of acknowledgement that what he'd done was wrong. But nothing changed. Richard kept the house I'd helped pay for, the car, the new girlfriend. His family closed ranks around him, decided my documented evidence was just my interpretation, that these things were complicated, that there were two sides to every story. Diane called me 2 days after Thanksgiving and left a voicemail saying I'd embarrassed the family, that I should be ashamed of myself for making such accusations in front of the children, that no wonder Richard had left me if I was going to be so dramatic and vindictive. Marcus stayed at his father's place almost full-time, refusing to speak to me beyond the occasional one-word text. I'd send him messages asking how he was, telling him I loved him, and I'd get back fine or okay or sometimes nothing at all. The court system didn't care about financial abuse that had happened during a marriage, only about what was happening now. And what was happening now was that I was still poor, still struggling, still alone. But here's the thing, and I need you to understand this, I was okay with it. Do you think that was fair? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Because I look at how it all turned out, at how Richard faced no real consequences, at how I lost my son and my family and my standing in the community, and I still think I did the right thing. I told the truth. I stopped protecting people who'd never protected me. I chose myself, finally, after 15 years of choosing everyone else. And maybe that doesn't look like justice to you. Maybe you wanted Richard to lose his job, or his girlfriend, or his freedom. Maybe you wanted Marcus to realize what his father had done and come crawling back with an apology. But the real victory wasn't external. It was internal. It was the moment I stopped believing Richard's lies about who I was and what I deserved. It was opening that secret bank account and watching it grow, proof that I was capable and competent and not the failure Richard had spent years telling me I was. It was walking out of that Thanksgiving dinner with my head held high, even though I knew it would cost me. It was choosing truth over comfort, reality over the fantasy that maybe if I just tried harder or sacrificed more, everything would work out. I moved us into an even smaller apartment after that, a one-bedroom where all 3 kids shared the bedroom, and I still slept on the couch. But I'd negotiated a raise at the clinic, taken on more hours. The manager, a woman named Patricia, who'd always been kind to me, pulled me aside one day and offered me a full-time position with benefits. "You're good at this job," she said, "and you're reliable. In this business, that's worth something." The raise was only $2 an hour, but it meant health insurance. It meant dental. It meant I could finally take Emma to get her cavity filled, the one she'd been ignoring for 6 months because we couldn't afford the dentist. I'd started seeing a therapist through a sliding-scale community program, working through 15 years of trauma and self-blame. Her name was Dr. Rodriguez, and she specialized in domestic violence recovery. Once a week, I'd sit in her small office and tell her things I'd never told anyone, and she'd listen without judgment and help me understand that none of it had been my fault. And I'd started saying no. No to Marcus when he asked me to cover expenses his father should be paying. No to Richard when he tried to get me to co-sign for another loan. No to his family when they invited me to events where I was expected to play along and pretend nothing had happened. 6 months after Thanksgiving, something unexpected happened. Marcus showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday evening, no warning, no phone call. I heard a knock on the door and opened it, and there he was. He'd been living with Richard full-time by then, and I'd barely seen him except for court-mandated visitation that he usually found excuses to skip. I opened the door, and there he was, 17 years old and trying so hard to look tough, but his eyes were red like he'd been crying. He asked if we could talk. We sat on my thrift store couch, the same one where I'd broken down with Linda, where I'd planned my escape, where I'd slept every night for the past 6 months. The metal bar was digging into my hip, but I didn't move. I just waited for Marcus to speak. And Marcus told me that he'd overheard Richard on the phone with Ashley, talking about money problems, about debts. Richard had been gambling again, apparently, losing big. And in the conversation, he'd said something about how it was just like before, how he'd always been able to get money out of me no matter what, how he'd known exactly how to play me. He was laughing about it, Marcus said, his voice shaking, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate you. And Ashley was saying something about how he needed to stop, and Dad said, "Don't worry, I learned my lesson. This time I'm only gambling with my own money." Marcus said when he heard that, when he heard his father casually admitting to manipulating me, something clicked. He started thinking about all the things I'd said at Thanksgiving, all the evidence I'd shown them. He started remembering the years when we'd been married, how I'd always been scrambling for money, how Richard had always had excuses. And for the first time, he let himself consider that maybe his father had been lying. Maybe I'd been telling the truth all along. He didn't apologize, not exactly. 17-year-old boys aren't great at that. But he said, "I'm sorry for some of the things I said. About you being poor, about you not trying hard enough. I didn't understand." He said he'd been angry about our situation, and it had been easier to blame me than to acknowledge that his father, the man he'd idolized, had been the architect of our destruction. I wanted to be angry at him. Part of me was. He'd spent the last year treating me like I was worthless, like my love meant nothing because it came without money. He'd said things that had cut me so deeply I wasn't sure the wounds would ever fully heal. But sitting there on that couch, looking at my son who was trying so hard to be strong while his worldview crumbled, I couldn't hold on to the rage. I just put my arm around him and told him I understood. That manipulation is insidious. That his father had fooled me for 15 years. That of course he'd fool Marcus too. That I didn't blame him for believing his father, for wanting to believe that at least one of his parents had their life together. We sat there for a long time, not talking, just being together in a way we hadn't been in months. His head was on my shoulder, and he was crying quietly, and I was crying too, and it felt like something that had been broken was starting to heal. He didn't move back in. The court custody arrangement stayed the same, and honestly, Richard's place had better Wi-Fi and more space. But Marcus started coming around more, started texting me without me having to initiate, started slowly, carefully, to rebuild a relationship that his father's lies had nearly destroyed. It wasn't redemption exactly, and it definitely wasn't revenge, but it was something. It was my son beginning to see me as a person rather than a failure. And that mattered more than any legal judgment could have. A year after the Thanksgiving confession, I took stock of where I was. Still poor by any objective measure, still working 2 jobs, still sleeping on a couch in a 1-bedroom apartment. The carpet still had stains I couldn't get out. The bathroom still had mold. The walls were still thin enough to hear the neighbors fighting. But I'd paid off half the debt Richard had accumulated in my name. My secret bank account had grown to almost $3,000. $3,000 that was mine, that no one else could touch. That represented possibility and hope, and a future I was building $1 at a time. I'd reconnected with some old friends who'd stuck by me after the divorce. Linda and I talked every week now, long phone calls where we'd catch each other up on our lives. She'd started inviting me to visit Portland, said I could stay with her, that we could explore the city together like we used to explore Phoenix when we were in college. I'd started taking an online class in medical coding, investing in a future that was mine. The certification would qualify me for better-paying jobs that might eventually let me afford a 2-bedroom apartment, jobs that came with retirement plans and advancement opportunities. It was slow going, studying after my kids went to bed, but I was doing it. I was building something. Emma had gotten a scholarship to a magnet school. Jake had made the honor roll. And Marcus, my complicated firstborn, had started introducing me to his girlfriend, including me in parts of his life I'd thought I'd lost forever. Her name was Sophia, and she was sweet and smart, and she treated Marcus with respect. And she was kind to me, which mattered more than I'd expected it to. I simplified everything, embraced it even, learned to find joy in things that didn't cost money. The library became my sanctuary, all those books that had been waiting for me to have time to read them again. I'd go every Sunday afternoon and come home with a stack of novels, lose myself in other people's stories, remember that there was a whole world beyond my struggle. I started walking in the park near our apartment every morning, reclaiming those 5 minutes of peace I'd given up with my coffee ritual. I'd wake up at 5:30 before the kids, before the heat of the day, and I'd walk the loop around the park. Just me and the early morning light and the desert birds singing in the mesquite trees. It didn't cost anything, but it was mine. My time, my peace, my small rebellion against the idea that I didn't deserve anything good. I discovered that happiness isn't about having enough money. It's about having enough autonomy, enough choice, enough freedom to be yourself without someone else controlling your resources and therefore your options. Before I end my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this. We need to talk about why victims stay in abusive relationships, because until we understand that, we can't help people get out. There's this cycle, this pattern that researchers have documented extensively. It starts with idealization, where the abuser is charming and loving and everything you've ever wanted. That was Richard when we first met, bringing me flowers and calling just to hear my voice and talking about our future together like it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Then comes devaluation, where they start to criticize and control. The subtle comments about my spending, my decisions, my ability to manage money, the slow erosion of my confidence until I started to doubt everything I thought I knew. Then there's the discard phase, where they pull away or find someone else. That was Richard, filing for divorce, moving in with Ashley, building a new life while I sorted through the wreckage of the old one. And just when you're ready to leave, they swing back to idealization, promising change, swearing it'll be different this time. Richard did this over and over during our marriage. Every time I discovered something new, Every time I questioned him, he'd have flowers and apologies and promises that this time would be different. That cycle creates something called trauma bonding. Your brain literally becomes addicted to the highs and lows, the cycle of abuse and reconciliation. Add in financial control, where the abuser manages all the money and you have no access to resources, and leaving becomes almost impossible. Where do you go when you have no savings, no credit, when every account is in his name or maxed out in yours? How do you support yourself and your kids when he's systematically destroyed your earning potential and your confidence? And here's what people don't talk about enough: the social isolation. Abusers cut you off from friends and family, usually so gradually you don't notice it's happening. They make you doubt your own perceptions through gaslighting. They recruit allies, people who will back up their version of events and make you seem like the crazy one. By the time you realize what's happening, you're so alone and so convinced that maybe you are the problem that leaving feels impossible. I stayed for 15 years because I believed that love and sacrifice would be enough. Because I thought that's what good mothers did, held their families together no matter the cost. Because Richard had convinced me that our financial struggles were my fault, that if I just managed better or worked harder, everything would be fine. Because I was ashamed of what was happening and I didn't want anyone to know I'd failed. Because I didn't have the language to describe what was happening to me, didn't know that financial abuse was a real thing with real patterns and real consequences. If you're reading this and you see yourself in my story, please know that it's not your fault. Not the debt, not the isolation, not the years you've lost. Abuse is a deliberate choice the abuser makes, and the fact that you loved someone who hurt you doesn't make you weak or stupid. It makes you human. The strength isn't in never falling for manipulation. The strength is in recognizing it and choosing to leave anyway, even when leaving is the hardest thing you've ever done. And if you know someone who's in a situation like mine was, don't judge them for staying. Don't ask why they don't just leave, as if it's that simple. Instead, be the friend Linda was for me. Bear witness to their truth. Help them see the patterns they've been conditioned to ignore. Give them information about resources, about support groups, about the fact that what's happening to them has a name and they're not alone. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is simply validate someone's reality when everyone else is telling them they're wrong. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I know this was long and heavy and probably brought up some difficult feelings, but I needed to tell this story, needed to put it out there so that maybe, somewhere, someone who's going through what I went through will know that they're not alone, that survival is possible, that you can lose almost everything and still rebuild a life that matters. I'd love to know where you're listening from, what time it is in your world right now. Did this story resonate with you? Have you or someone you know experienced financial abuse? And here's what I really want to know. What would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted Richard publicly like I did, even knowing it wouldn't change anything legally? Or would you have stayed quiet and just focused on rebuilding? Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think or feel or understand something you didn't before, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. It helps other people find these stories, helps us build a community of people who understand that surviving isn't the same as living, but it's the first step. And please subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be sharing more stories about resilience, about the messy, complicated reality of rebuilding after betrayal, about what it really takes to reclaim your life when someone else has tried to destroy it. I've got 2 other videos I think you might want to watch after this. One is about recognizing the early warning signs of financial abuse, the red flags I wish I'd seen before I signed that power of attorney. The other is about practical steps for rebuilding your financial life after abuse, all the things I learned the hard way about credit repair and debt management and starting over from nothing. Both of those are linked in the description below. Until the next story, take care of your heart, protect your peace, and remember, you deserve better than someone who makes you feel small for having less. Your worth isn't measured in dollars or square footage or the things you can provide. Your worth is inherent, unchangeable, and nobody has the right to diminish it. Not your partner, not your kids, not anyone. You are enough exactly as you are. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise.